Today we're going to be taking a look at how to get started with one of my personal favorite medium format film cameras, the Mamiya RZ67. The RZ67 uses 120 spool film and shoots a 6x7 centimeter negative. Out of the three most widely used medium format sizes, 6x7 is oftentimes the highest regarded, as it is the closest you can get to the look and feel of a sheet of 4x5 film without actually having to shoot a 4x5 camera. In my opinion, the best feature of the RZ67 is its modularity. You can build this camera up to your very specific liking with a wide variety of different options and accessories. To get started, you're going to need the camera body itself, a viewfinder, a film back, and of course a lens. Many kits available for purchase online include all of these essential pieces, but you can also hunt them down separately if you have a very specific setup in mind right off the bat. There are several different viewfinders available for the RZ67, but the most common one, and the only one I have at the moment, is the waist level. To attach the waist level finder to the top of the camera, squeeze down on both of the blue switches on either side of the Mamiya logo, slide it on, and then let go so it clicks into place. The RZ67 film back comes with a dark slide, which is a thin sheet of metal that goes between the film back and the camera body. As you can see, with the film back detached, I am unable to pull the dark slide out, which is a safety feature this camera thankfully has to prevent accidental exposures. To attach the film back, first make sure it isn't in lock position, and then line up the 4 silver knobs on the camera body with their corresponding holes. With the film back locked into place, I am now allowed to safely remove the dark slide. Before mounting the lens, make sure the white dot on the bayonet ring is lined up with the red dash. Now you can line both of these up with the red dot on the camera body and rotate the bayonet ring counterclockwise to secure the lens to the body. You are now ready to load a roll of film into the camera. It is important to note that this can be done regardless of whether or not the film back is mounted. I most often load my film with the back attached, but for the sake of clarity, I'm going to disconnect it for this video. To open the film back, you're going to want to pull each of these 2 tabs out like this. Remove the film cartridge and set the film back itself off to the side for the time being. Since 120 film is reel to reel, you're always going to need an empty spool to use as your take-up spool. Once you shoot your first roll, you're going to be able to use the empty spool from that one as your next take-up spool, and so on and so forth. But if this is your first roll of 120 film ever, and the camera you purchased didn't come with an empty spool already loaded into the film magazine, you are going to need to get one to start shooting, and they can be purchased online in a pack for around $7 to $10. In this case, we have an empty spool here from the roll I just finished shooting, which I will move over to the take-up side by pressing this little button on the bottom of the film magazine. Now that your take-up spool is in place, you can unwrap your film and peel off the label. Take the leader or tongue of your film and pull it around the back of your film cartridge so that the black side is facing out. And once you reach the take-up spool, you're going to want to insert that tongue into the slot just like this. Slowly crank the dial on top in the direction of the arrow to make sure your leader catches, and keep cranking until you see the arrow on the backing paper match up with the arrow on your film cartridge. You are now ready to replace the film cartridge in your film back and reattach the film back to the camera body. To advance your film to the first frame, repeatedly press down on the film advance lever until you see this little window show the number 1. Luckily, there isn't really any room for error here, and if everything is working properly, it should catch at this point, and it won't allow you to advance the film any further until you've shot the first frame. The waist level finder flips up and locks into place and allows you to look directly down onto the focusing screen. This finder also comes with a flip-up magnifier you can use to really dial in your focus, especially in harsh lighting conditions where you might not be able to see every detail of the focusing screen as clearly. This camera has a bellows focusing system, which is one of the huge upsides in my opinion, as it allows precise focus at almost any distance. Another important thing to note is that all the lenses for the RZ67 are leaf shutter lenses, which means that the shutter is located in the lens itself instead of in front of the focal plane. One of the main benefits of this is that you can sync your flash at any shutter speed up to the maximum of 1/400th of a second, as opposed to having a maximum flash sync speed like you would on most focal plane shutter cameras. To focus the camera, twist one of these 2 knobs on either side. They both do the exact same thing, and the only difference at all is that the one on the left side has this little lever, which locks your focus into place if it is flipped up. The shutter speed dial is located on the left side of the camera. As is pretty standard for medium format, the RZ67 has shutter speeds of 400 all the way down to bulb. This last setting, which looks like a little bullseye or red dot, you only want to use if you have a metered prism that has automatic exposure. Aperture is controlled with this ring located on the lens. The blue dial is used to calculate depth of field and doesn't actually affect anything about the lens itself when you rotate it. This little lever you can press down on the side of the lens is your depth of field preview. This switch that has the letter T and the letter N is for timed exposures, and if you slide it over to T for timed, it will cause the shutter to remain open until you slide it back to N for normal. You're going to want to make sure this is set to N for pretty much everything you shoot that isn't a long exposure. Something I want to make sure I'm clear about is that there's not a light meter built into this camera itself. If you have one of the metered prism finders, you'd have one in that case, but if you just have the waist level like I do, you would have to rely on either an external handheld light meter or just your own knowledge of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Once you've composed your image using the waist level viewfinder and the two focusing knobs, you're ready to fire. The shutter button is located on the bottom right of the camera below the lens. Before you fire your shutter, make sure your dark slide is removed because the shutter will not fire if this isn't the case. A red light will also flash near the bottom of the viewfinder if your dark slide is in the way, which is extremely convenient. Once a frame is exposed, an orange indicator will appear next to the number in the little window. Advance your film to the next frame by pressing down once on the film advance lever, and just like that, you'll be ready to start thinking about your next image. Another one of the coolest features is the rotating back, which is controlled with this switch right here on the right side of the camera. The middle position locks the back in place, so to switch between landscape and portrait orientation, you're going to want to set it to R for rotate. This allows the back to swivel freely. Again, this is super helpful because I do shoot a lot of my work in portrait orientation, and since the RZ67 is such a big clunky box, this really simplifies the whole process for me, and I don't have to attempt to turn it sideways at all, especially with the waist level viewfinder. The M position is for multiple exposures. What this does is disengage the film back from communicating with the camera body. In this mode, you'll still be able to cock the shutter with the film advance lever and take your shot, the only difference being that it doesn't advance the film back and you can create a double exposure this way. One last feature I feel like I need to point out is this little dial, which is located right behind the shutter button. The white dot in the middle indicates regular operation, so this is where you want the dial to be pretty much whenever you're using the camera. The red circle locks the shutter, which is another great safety feature for if you're going to be traveling with your camera or in a setting where the shutter might accidentally get bumped. The orange dot is the emergency shutter release setting, which will allow you to fully mechanically fire the shutter at 1/400th of a second, regardless of whether or not there is a battery or film in the camera. There are actually a total of 27 different lenses you can buy for the Mamiya RZ67, ranging all the way from the 37mm fisheye all the way up to the 500mm. The 110 is the kit lens for this camera, which makes it difficult to find on its own, but a lot of the full kits for sale on the internet do include this lens. The other most popular lens is the 90mm, which is considered the normal focal length of the human eye. What you do have to keep in mind though is that with medium format lenses, the focal length value is practically double from if we were talking about 35mm. So the regular 50mm kit lens that would be included with most basic 35mm SLRs would be very similar in focal length to the 110 on the RZ67. Right now I have two lenses for this camera, the 180 and the 50mm wide. I shoot the majority of my work with the 180 because I find the focal length to be very similar to the starting point of the 70 to 210 that I use on my Nikon F1, and that's always been a pretty safe distance for me when it comes to shooting people's cars and houses and stuff. I would like to buy a 90mm lens eventually, but the prices on those continue to rise, so at the moment that is not necessarily a top priority. One of the coolest things about the modular design of this camera is how you can actually switch up the type of film you're shooting mid-roll, as long as you have at least one extra film back and dark slide. There are also several other types of back available to buy, like a Polaroid one, which is something I definitely would like to get my hands on one of these days. An extremely helpful accessory I have is the left-hand grip, which is a handle that screws into the tripod mount on the bottom of the camera body and allows you to hold the camera with one hand as well as fire the shutter by squeezing the trigger. This heavily reduces camera shake and makes this tank of a camera just a little easier to deal with when you're out and about. Something else you're probably going to want is a shutter release cable for nighttime and long exposures, which can be purchased for around $7 to $10 in most camera stores and screws right into this port on the side of the lens. All this is a nifty little tool that fires the leaf shutter from a distance to drastically minimize camera shake if you're using a tripod and shooting at basically any lower shutter speed. Besides lenses, the main thing I would still like to get for this camera would be an eye-level viewfinder, just because sometimes the waist level is a little bit inconsistent with the perspective I have in mind when I'm composing an image. But that definitely doesn't take away from the experience of creating amazing photos with this camera. I would consider my kit to be pretty complete otherwise. Shooting with it is a very natural and hands-on experience, and I'm usually able to make photos that are pretty close to my inspiration in real life, and that is hugely important. Since I originally transitioned into medium format with the Bronica ETRS, I can't personally attest to how the learning curve would be if you were to pick up this camera after only shooting 35mm, but the one thing I will say is that you'll probably get used to it pretty quick regardless of your skill level, and its versatility will surprise you. In other words, if you've been thinking about buying one of these cameras, I would suggest you just go for it. I haven't looked back since owning mine, and I've personally never been happier with the images that I'm creating. That concludes my little overview of the Mamiya RZ67. I hope you were able to find something useful in this video, or that I maybe influenced you to try this camera at some point in the near future. If you want to check out some of my work, you can search me on Instagram. It is samdofficial. You could also check out my website, which is just samofficial.com. The links to both of those will be in the description. I definitely plan on making more videos like this in the future about other cameras that I own or have used, so stay tuned for that. And as always, thank you so much for watching and supporting.